Hi everyone and welcome. I'd like to begin today's Lean In session by acknowledging that we're gathered all across the country today on the unceded lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'm personally speaking to you from EmAGN or Brisbane, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Turrbal and the Yagara people and their elders past, present and emerging. So a big welcome to everyone today. And if you're comfortable, we'd love you to turn your cameras on so that we can see your lovely faces and speak to you directly. But if you're not, don't worry. We don't have to have the cameras on. So today's Lean In session is really an acknowledgement of two things. Firstly, that the world is quite an unequal place, and we've seen that recently with climate change affecting populations with some of the smallest carbon footprints, the pandemic affecting different groups in different ways, and the Black Lives Matter movement highlighting the injustices and lack of safety for people with dark skin color. And the second acknowledgement is that we as individuals and young people or starting out in our careers can often feel completely overwhelmed by these unequal systems that we encounter, and we don't always know how to respond or how to change or how to feel like we can make a difference. But I think that we, particularly as part of the architectural profession, are in a really unique position to respond to the question of equality and inclusiveness, because we work collaboratively with large groups of people. We're taught to think critically and problem solve, and we get to design the built environment that our society inhabits. So I guess some people might think, oh, society's working really great and I don't need to change, and why do we need to practice more inclusively? So at a larger scale, in response to that, is that our society's stability really does depend on how inclusive we are, particularly things like accessing employment and housing and education, and space has a really big impact on that inclusivity. And on this broader scale, if we become less inclusive or more unequal as a society, we can become fraught with war and tension, and our economy can become unstable, and this affects everyone. And I guess at a personal level, well, I'll make a guess that everyone here has probably felt excluded from something at some point in their lives. And there's that feeling of not being welcome or not invited, or that you're not wanted. Maybe it's because you were rejected or because you looked different or being bullied, and that just makes you feel horrible. And I'm sure you remember how that made you feel. And of course, at a personal level, we don't want to perpetuate that within our workplaces or in our designs. And you may have experienced that feeling of exclusion or feeling unwelcome, but you might not have experienced it in the way that our speakers will be talking about it tonight, but you've probably felt it in some way in your life. So on the one hand, inclusive practice is not just the right thing to do, the moral and ethical thing to do. It's actually important and in everyone's best interest to uphold a well-functioning society and a workplace and way of life. So we have three incredible speakers in our panel tonight who are going to give you some practical tips on how you can contribute through practicing inclusively, and I'm so excited to welcome them tonight. Before I do introduce the speakers, we have a representative from the Australian Institute of Architects National Committee for Gender Equity, and she'd like to say a few words. So we have Jane Williams, and she is an architect, director and business leader. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Carly. As mentioned, my name is Jane Williams, and tonight for me and the committee, it's a wonderful example of the work that we do in the National Committee for Gender Equity on behalf of the Institute and its members, and how we support and help others, which for tonight has included helping the organisers connect with amazing thought leaders such as Catherine Foxx, who you will hear from shortly. Just very briefly, the National Committee for Gender Equity is involved in setting and enabling strategies for the Institute and its members through the lenses of gender and diversity within a framework of policy, education and advocacy. I'm leading a national awards and honours task force for the next 2 years, which look to increase inclusivity, awareness and participation of female architects and others in existing Institute awards and honours programs, including fellowship, life fellow, gold medalists and more, and extending this to increase architects' overall participation in other award programs such as the Order of Australia. Thank you once again, SONA and EmAGN, for allowing me to have a brief introduction tonight. Over to you.
Thanks, Jane. I now have the great pleasure of introducing our first of three speakers, Catherine Foxx. If anyone has any questions at all, just type them in the chat box and I'll go through them all at the end when we have time for a bit of a Q&A. Catherine is speaking to us from Sydney tonight and is a leading and award-winning journalist, editor, author and presenter. I first came across her work in about 2017 when I read her book, Stop Fixing Women. And if any of my friends are in the audience, you probably received that book for Christmas. And I actually gave it to my stepbrother on the birth of his second daughter. And the reason I was so excited about this book and Catherine's work is that it was finally a book about inclusive workplaces that didn't blame women for their own marginalization. And this is really what this talk is about, to ensure that the assumptions in organizations and our designs are not based on these stereotypes and norms that cause problems of inequality in the first place. So thank you so much for being here, Catherine. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm particularly delighted that you're giving my book out as presents. It's lovely, and I'm still getting feedback about my proposition in the book, if you like, so that's great to hear. Thank you very much for inviting me, and to all of you who have managed to turn up. My goodness, what an interesting time we're living in, and I promise no jokes about borders, so no jokes about borders. But I did want to talk to you tonight just for a few minutes when we're going to have a Q&A session later. I thought I'd talk to you in responding to some of the brief about what can we do, how can we ensure that we have inclusive work, what can we all do on a sort of daily basis, talking a little bit about the macro and then coming in with a bit of the micro, some of the practical things that we can indeed do to change things. So the macro, you've heard about the book Stop Fixing Women. I've been a commentator and advocate in this area for, just a few decades. Started when I was 5. Look, it's a bad joke, but I'm going to make it anyway. One of the things that I had observed, and I've written a number of books and I was a columnist for many years on this topic, one of the things I'd observed about organisations of all kinds was that there was a tendency, if they did address this area at all, was a tendency to say, well, look, it's you women. What a shame. Strangely and coincidentally, you seem to be lacking in all the qualities we need for leadership. Gee, isn't that interesting? You don't have confidence, you're not good at risk, you're not good negotiators, and so on. And in my area, we call this the deficit model. And I was just acutely aware that many organisations were wasting time, money, and precious attention on trying to fix women. And when I say fix women, sending them off to remedial workshops, the sheep dip approach, we like to call it, dunking them in and out and saying that everything will be all right at the end. And all those systemic barriers, the sexism and bias, will suddenly disappear. Now, to say this was ineffectual is a little bit of an understatement. And the fact that I can say that with some conviction, because actually progress has been incredibly slow. And very sadly at the moment, in the middle of this awful pandemic and crisis, I feel like we're going backwards at a rate of knots. So I think that having this discussion and getting rejuvenated and talking about what we can do, because there is also an opportunity at the moment to change dynamics. But who can forget at the beginning of the lockdown, just a few short months ago, feels like a decade, that we heard hairdressers would be open for half-hour appointments. Every woman in Australia rolled her eyes. So that's a minor example, but it's very indicative of the fact women were not consulted. Women's experience and the fact that most of us need a great deal longer than half an hour in the hairdresser was just not taken into account. Much more seriously, how sobering and sad it was to see that free childcare was cut off really, really quickly, and that those areas of women's need and indeed family and community need were being, again, not taken properly into account. Now, I live in hope, but I think it's very sad to see that. What I said in Stop Fixing Women to organisations, and I spoke to a lot of male leaders who are actually doing something about this, is you are doing some expensive stuff, some of you, that is a bit of a waste of time, because actually, if you say to half the cohort, you're the ones who are the problem and you have to fix it up, you're not changing the dynamics of the workplace. And the reality is that the people in charge are still overwhelmingly white men in Australia. We all know the stats, and I don't need to run through them again. And also what we were doing with Stop Fixing Women was regurgitating a set of really restrictive stereotypes that had caused the problem in the first place. The lack of confidence, as I mentioned, lack of negotiation, lack of appetite for risk and ambition. And by the way, those are all things, as I said, that are kind of seen as real markers of potential leadership quality. So it's a really awful undermining sort of thread to keep playing in organisations. When I looked at what would actually change things, it was very much about intervening to change the way systems operate, how you recruited people, how you advertised jobs, who you put onto projects and teams, how you recognised and rewarded people. In other words, it wasn't looking, and by the way, a lot of those things that I just pointed out as being deficits, they're the symptoms, not the cause of sexism. They're the way that women behave sometimes because they've been spoken over, they've been interrupted. They think, oh, well, I won't put my hand up for that assignment because I probably won't get it. So it's also a very simplistic reading of behaviour. And also that one about confidence drives me completely spare because we seem to measure confidence in a very alpha male way still, which does not apply to a lot of men as well. So let me be clear here, male stereotypes are equally pernicious and not as applicable either. So yes, so that's what I set out to do. I've had some feedback which would indicate that it's actually resonated. A lot of people have said to me from organisations that they've looked at the way that they structure their diversity and inclusion efforts. Sadly, at the moment, we know a lot of them have been put on hold because of the conditions we're living through, and I think that's a shame. But I have heard from some organisations that they've actually doubled down and said, look, this is a time when we have to make sure that we are paying attention to them. We've already heard mention of Black Lives Matter and some of the things that we're seeing around the globe. So again, I think that there are some rays of hope there. Stop Fixing Women, as I say, it has had some resonance on that sort of corporate level, if you like, or the broad brush. But what I've also been really interested in is hearing from women who've actually taken it to heart and also sort of tried to practice it in their organisations. After Stop Fixing Women, I wrote a book with Kirsten Ferguson, who's a Brisbane-based director and a fantastic woman, called Womankind. And what we were looking at in Womankind was the power of women coming together. Kirsten had run a social media campaign called Celebrating Women, and it started about a year before the Me Too movement came out of the blocks, and we were just fascinated by what was happening on social media. So I wanted to just talk for just a few minutes about some of the things that we spoke about in the book and that we've spoken about to many audiences about, if you like, almost sort of tactics. How do you change the way that if you see injustices or unfairness indeed in your workplace, but you're not in a powerful position, for example, how can you go about triggering change or getting people interested? So one of the things that we talked about in Womankind was amplification. It's not our term, I wish it was. It was actually first coined by a group of women who were working in the first Obama administration, interestingly enough, who found that they weren't getting listened to in meetings, that they were in a minority, that they were interrupted constantly and so on. So they decided to team together. So if there were 2 or 3 of them in a meeting, they'd back each other up. So if one of them was interrupted, the other one would say, well, can we just let Mary finish what she was saying? They had a number of tactics that they used around the meeting table and in discussions. Now, of course, eventually their male colleagues and the president twigged to what was going on, but said, fair enough. Right, it did change. They realised what had been happening. So it changed the dynamics of how meetings operated, but whose ideas were and whose voices were heard, very importantly. Amplifying is something that women can do for each other all the time. And it's one of those things you can start doing immediately in the workplace. Mentioning another woman when something comes up about a new project or job, just backing up each other, passing on referrals and advice. And in fact, a lot of women do this anyway, but there's a really interesting sort of case study around amplification. And if you haven't heard of it, do give it a Google and read about some of the things they did. And it worked really well. Men are brilliant amplifiers of women. So when you get a bloke who wants to really come in and back women, that has enormous cut through. So that was one of the things that we went into in quite a lot of detail. The other things, trying to detect if an organisation is sort of an organisation that you feel will be inclusive was another thing we were asked to discuss. That's a really interesting one. I always think there's a really basic sort of way of measuring that, and to look at the top ranks. What do they look like? Are they a mixture? Do you have people of different ages, ethnicities, and so on? Or is it a very homogenous bunch? Because I think that's just a very early litmus test of what's happening. The other one, and I say this partially tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, because there's a really interesting study which detected something called the Meritocracy Paradox. So just watch out for those companies that tell you they're strongly reinforce that they're a meritocracy, because the research tells us they're actually the least diverse. In fact, it's a very interesting study. It was conducted in the US a while ago. But the ones who are always championing their meritocracy credentials maybe are ones to watch out for a little bit. By the way, the reason the researchers suspect that those companies, they're very good at trumpeting it, but everyone just assumes they're a meritocracy, so no one makes an effort. And one thing we know about creating diverse and inclusive workplaces, you have to put in some hard yards. You have to make sure that decision-making, that you have ways of ensuring that you're not going back to those old appointing like for like, and so on, and those networks that we know have existed for a long time actually requires quite a lot of work. Just on a couple of other things, we'll probably get more about this in the questions, but tactics. I love a few tactics. I've become really fond of the old, when somebody says, why do you women get all of this? You know, you've got to be a woman these days to get on a board. I like answering questions with questions these days. I've become that kind of person. Well, why do you say that? I often say to the rather foolish person who questions some of these things. But, you know, it's surprising how often it comes up. Tell me why you're saying that. Well, where did you get your information from? Well, that's interesting because the data doesn't show that. So I'm often one to say, you know, if you're caught in one of those situations, it's one of those elevator conversations. The other one that people often tell me they're asked is, often just before the event that I'm speaking at, is why do you women get to go to these functions all the time? And she said, she always says, but you're welcome, come along with me. We never say it's for women only. So different ways of handling that. The other one I'm just going to leave you with, which I think is pure brilliance, not mine. Jamila Rizvi, the writer and commentator, was speaking about this once. She said, you know, when someone says something really horribly sexist or racist, often in the workplace, and you're all sort of sitting around and everyone's, well, a lot of you are uncomfortable, but no one knows what to say. She said, she always leans forward and says, could you just repeat that? I don't think I heard it. It's pure brilliance, of course, because if they repeat it, well, they're even more of a prat. But the fact is, it's been noted. And I think the important point is those circuit breakers do make a difference to how discourse and informal chatter happens. And we shouldn't also discount the fact that that's how you do gradually shift norms about what's acceptable. So language, I'm a writer, language is enormously important in all of these things. Look, I'll wind up because I know we're all on a fairly brief sort of time slot. I do hope we can have a bit more of a chat though with some Q&A. And the final thing I would say, if you are starting out and you don't have much power, the most important thing I think I can leave you with is to move together, to always do things together. There's a great example a few years back, 2 or 3 now. The BBC had a big gender pay gap scandal. They had to publish their top earners, and lo and behold, in that 100 list of top earners, there were very few women. The most egregious example was their China correspondent, who was paid 50% what the other male correspondents were paid. Anyway, long story short, the women of the BBC came together, and their advice was, don't go on your own to a manager or someone. Always make sure that you have a group, that it's either some colleagues, some peers, perhaps there's a women's network in the BBC, maybe there's a women's network where you work, but make sure that you always do it, because the one-on-one stuff often doesn't go anywhere, and it can leave you feeling quite exposed. So again, a lesson from the whole Me Too campaign. When one woman says she's been sexually harassed, she often doesn't get listened to. When millions of women around the world stood up and said, this is my experience, things started to change. So, and we've seen some examples of that with AMP recently. So I'm going to leave that there, but I think the whole point about moving as a cohort and making the most of our strength of numbers, we are, by the way, 51% of the Australian population, just saying. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. It's so useful to have some clear tactics and also some phrases that you can borrow and kind of have in your arsenal so that you don't have to kind of think up something on the spot. That's really useful. Our next speaker is Daniel Santangeli. Daniel is the co-CEO of Footscray Community Arts Centre in Melbourne, and he is focused on community engaged practice with diverse communities, which is really a lovely complement to the speakers tonight. And I came across Daniel's work because I bought this fantastic book called The Relationship is the Project. And actually, I think I just wanted to read his entire chapter to everyone, but that would be extremely boring. And we want to get Daniel here in person. But I thought I'd read just a really small snippet of it by way of a bio, because I thought it was so powerful. And he writes that in the chapter called Working with Queer Communities and Artists, he writes, there are lots of letters in LGBTQI+ for a reason. They are made up of many and diverse communities. In the face of rising conservatism and lateral violence, the most radical thing we can do when creating queer spaces is to make them inclusive, safe, and accessible. And I think that that's certainly something that we as architects can contribute to. So welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, and thank you, Carly, and also thank you, Kathleen and Catherine as well. It was really, it's a hard act to follow, really. I would just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we gather as well, and particularly pay respects to the elders past and present of the Kulin Nation where I am today. I'm going to be speaking to about Footscray Community Arts Centre and our approach to community engaged practice. So Footscray Community Arts Centre is a multi-arts centre located in the western suburbs of Melbourne. We work with 4 key different communities, which we roughly describe as First Nations, LGBTQIA+, culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and artists with disability. We work with those communities to present contemporary art, and also our staff reflect those communities that we work with as well. FCAC has a 45-year history of working in this space. It was founded as part of the union movement in the 70s, and was really based on the principle of access for all. At the time, that was about access for all for, Italians and Greeks who lived in the West and needed access to creativity because they were totally cut off from the CBD, both culturally and also in terms of infrastructure. But over time, as the West has changed, as waves of migration have happened in the West, the FCAC has kind of more broadened its remit as time goes on. The West continues to change, but maybe not necessarily becoming more diverse, but becoming more overdeveloped and more gentrified. And Footscray's population is due to increase by 179% within 20 years. And when you stand at FCAC, you've got the river on one side, and then the other 3 sides have apartment blocks. So we feel really cut off from, I guess, the kind of diversity and vibrancy that was kind of really directly around FCAC. One thing I wanted to quickly touch on, but I won't talk to it in detail, was last year FCAC commissioned a report by Parallel Practice, which is a practice-based research lab led by Andrew Simpson and Professor Alan Pert, on the future infrastructure needs of the arts precinct. And it's really intended to be a roadmap for the big picture needs of the centre to really ensure that there is an FCAC in 45 years' time, and one that's able to continue to deliver on excellence and community engaged practice. I think this might have been shared with you, I'm not too sure, but you know, it's a really interesting report, and I would highly recommend having a look at it. And if it's something that really does particularly pique your interest, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to kind of chat to you about it or anything like that. I'm not going to talk in any more detail about the precinct plan, but I did think it was worth noting. What I do want to talk about is what community engaged practice looks like at FCAC. FCAC is a really complex place, and each of those different communities we work with is so different to the next. There's a lot of intersectionality between those communities, and every project we do is so different to the next one. There's no cookie cutter kind of approach to community engaged practice. Every project is different, and the methodology that we apply to every project is different. I think what kind of sits at the heart of what we mean when we say community engaged practice is that it's really about acknowledging that communities have skills and experiences that are necessary to realise a project, and that a project can't be done properly without that engagement or collaboration. Community engaged practice is the community that we build around a project. It's not some sort of, when we think about community, we kind of imagine this like community over there in the distance that we need to go and engage with. That's not what community engaged practice is. It's about the project and the relationships that sit around it. And when you get it right, a project is more solid and more strong. And it means you don't end up with, say, I don't know, a Disney film that's been boycotted by the community that it's meant to represent, for example. It means you end up with a university that feels safe. It means you end up with a hospital that feels culturally safe for those it's meant to serve. That's what you get when you do community engaged practice well. At FCAC, we have a working methodology that we use for community engaged practice. And yeah, like Catherine said, fan of asking questions. This methodology is just the whole list of questions that we ask ourselves, and there's 10 kind of key questions. And it's really intended to be a kind of prompt for staff and producers who are working, and when they're developing a project, for them to kind of come back to kind of inform their thinking. I'm not going to talk through all of those questions, but I've plucked out 2 that I thought might just be worth sharing as a bit of an insight to what we do. The first question is kind of one of the foundation questions of good CACD practice, which is who's not here that should be here? When I first heard this question, it was a revelation to me. And it really is about, often when we're building a team around a project, we look at the skills that we need. But actually, it's about looking at the lived experiences that are also necessary to make a project as full as it can be. When we think about building a team around a project at FCAC, we also think about who that project is meant to be representing. And that is the disability mantra of nothing about us without us, which gets used by a wide variety of communities, really rings true here. We think about authorship, whose story is being told. We think about appropriation, which, you know, what signs and symbols are we using and who do they belong to? Is there permission to share this story? And what elders and artists and leaders from the community that we're working with need to be present in the project? We also ask ourselves about who needs to carry the relationships in this project. When we're doing projects at FCAC, I don't carry all the relationships. I just don't, there's no way I don't have the bandwidth for that. And neither do our producers either. So we work with people who can also carry some of those relationships with us. And often they're, you know, community liaisons or people who are deeply embedded in specific communities so that we're not having to constantly reinvent the wheel every time we work with the community. We're able to tap into networks that are there. One community that is, when we're building a project, one specific question that we ask is about what is the role of First Nations peoples on this project. FCAC is grounded in place, and we take our, the relationship that we have with Aboriginal people, particularly Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri, but also, for lack of a better term, Aboriginal diaspora who live in the area and locally. We take that relationship really, really seriously. And we work with an Indigenous advisory group who's made up of elders and artists and cultural leaders who help us establish what the relationship is with the project, whether that's historical or protocol, or whether it's connected with kind of whether it's appropriate to bring on, say, traditional owners for a project. They help us kind of work through some of that stuff so we can kind of understand what that relationship should be with First Nations peoples. And then how we go about honouring that relationship and building that into the project. And that's different for every project that we work on. So that's that question of who's not here that should be here. The second question that I want to share with you is how can we actively build and nurture relationships? So community engagement for us doesn't happen because we paid some people to consult with us or because we held a forum. That might be part of it, but community engaged practice for us is when it has a meaningful, lasting impact, and that requires relationship building. My predecessor, Jade Lilly, who is the editor of that book, The Relationship is the Project, her mantra was the relationship is the project, and that's still very true at FCAC. And when we think about how we can go about building relationships, we show up at community events, we invite community to our events, we listen, we ask questions without anticipating the answer. And we make sure that we build time into our project schedules as well, because relationships take time to build. So we can't do a flashy project if the groundwork isn't done. And I think that kind of connects again with what Catherine said around doing the hard yards. You've got to do the hard yards if you want the community engaged bit to work. One thing that I wanted to share with you is a quote from Saul Alinsky, who is an African-American, or was an African-American community activist. And in his book, Rules for Radicals, he says, never go outside the experience of the people you are working with. The idea of meeting people where they're at is key. This is true for community engaged practice as it is for community activism. Start where people are at, use the language that they use, meet where they meet, build the project from their reference points rather than your own. At FCAC, we always ask if there's a clear social contract with the communities we're working with. And there are some questions we ask ourselves to kind of establish whether that social contract is clear. We make sure that our motives are being transparent, we're being transparent with our motives. We don't pretend a project is bigger or flashier than it is. And we also don't pretend that a community's engagement is going to be less than what it is. We make sure there's a paper trail, so there's transparency and accountability both ways. And we try to be clear about what we're asking for from community, whether that's participation or consultation or collaboration or leadership. And we try to make sure there's a clear end date. Everyone should understand when the project is over and when their role is over, so that there's room for that community or that individual that we're working with to be able to shift the nature of their relationship with us or move on to something else. And on the theme of having a clear end date, just the one last thing that I'd say is that what's also really important in FCAC in terms of building relationships is making sure that that relationship is supported financially as well. We always make sure that if we're asking someone to do labour for us, that we're paying them for their time. And that we're also making sure that the kind of care that's required to build relationships is supported financially in the budgets that we build as well. And that we even have a contingency line in our budget But in addition to that, we also have a care line that's the same amount, so that if somebody needs an emergency visit to the doctor or can't afford a cab to get to rehearsals or whatever it might be, we're able to kind of dip into that pool of money to be able to support community, to help dissolve or remove some of those barriers that might exist for their participation. I hope that just gives a bit of an insight to some of the thinking at Footscray Community Arts Centre. I can't wait for this pandemic to be over so we can reopen the doors, and when that does happen, I really hope that you are able to come and visit us at FCAC and experience it for yourself if you haven't before. And really genuinely that offer is there. You know, the doors are always open, so if you want to come in and say hi, please do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That's such a generous offer. And I think that first question of who's not here that should be here is something that we could all implement and all ask that question at that very first meeting, even if we're kind of lower down in the food chain of the office, so to speak. So we've reached 7 o'clock, but I think maybe could we ask the presenters if they'd like to stay for a bit of a Q&A for anyone who is interested in asking some questions for a few minutes. I actually have to leave, so if other people have to leave, that's totally fine, but I'm going to throw to Jess, who is the EmAGN co-chair, and she's going to lead some of the questions, and feel free at any point to leave when you have to leave. We usually do our lean-in sessions on a Wednesday at 6, so we'll let you know when the next one is, but I'm going to handball over to Jess. And thank you so much to all of the speakers. I have a notebook full of notes now with really fantastic takeaways and tips. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Carly. And I'd like to join you in thanking everyone for their amazing presentations.
Thank you.
It's been just so fantastic to hear everyone's points. And I know I've gotten a lot out of it. Really useful information. So some of the questions that we've got are, the first one is, as an early career architect or graduate that may not have much influence over a company or studio policy, are there any actions that we can take to help better inform our colleagues or studios from our position?
Shall I just jump in? I think, as I think I mentioned when I was speaking, I think that is really hard on your own. This is where I think that either tapping into or even creating your own network, and when I say creating, it doesn't have to be super flash. I just mean often you'll find in organisations, no matter how small they are, that women sort of tend to have a network. Often meets in the ladies' loo is my experience. But look, it happens all the time informally. It's why that whole sort of idea that our women are all trying to do each other in. I mean, some women are unpleasant to other women, you know, like we're human. A lot of men are really horrible to each other too. We don't kind of tag them in the same way. My experience has been a lot of women that I've worked with have been super supportive. They've not usually done it in a really overt way because we get beaten up a bit about it. You know, blokes don't seem to like women gathering together and chatting. Jermaine Greer always said it made them very uncomfortable. But I think, you know, find your cohort and you'll find it's enormously handy. And I did mention before, and it wasn't meant to be flippant, find your male allies. They will be there as well. They are there. Often enough, I find that empathetic men just sort of feel a bit compromised. They don't quite know how to kind of back you up and whatever. But look, honestly, they will be there. So if you really think, oh, look, there's something here that really needs addressing, do it with a group, but be really structured about it and say, look, I've looked at this. Here's what I think could really help. And if you are looking for resources, there's some fantastic ones. So there's a lot written in the media these days, thankfully, but also the Workplace Gender Equality Agency has some wonderful tools. Their pay gap data, but also their tools to address the pay gap, for example, are excellent. So that's all free. There's even websites now that can show you how to write job ads so that they're not sexist. And this stuff, by the way, has been very well researched. So certain kinds of language in job ads can really put people off, particularly marginalised people. So there's a whole lot of tools out there. And they're really useful. So I would say there's ways of kind of working that out within your workplace with like-minded people, and then there's other tools you can bring to bear.
Fantastic. Thanks, Catherine. I wonder if Daniel or Kathleen, you have anything to jump in on that one at all?
Yeah, I'm happy to add a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think my experience is that diversity, I hate using that word, but it's the one that often makes sense. That diversity tends to be also quite contagious. Also another word I shouldn't use, but it tends to be quite contagious as well in the workplace. Like once people begin to realize that that's a thing, it does tend to kind of spread throughout the organization. And often it's just about finding sort of small ways to kind of push that. I think what I do find that has been useful in some organizations where I haven't had a big voice is to use the competitiveness of other organizations and say, oh, that organization that we compete with all the time is doing First Nations training. That's really interesting. And then someone, oh, maybe we should do that. So, there's, I think the softly approach and that does have an impact.
Yeah, awesome. I also love a softly, and the idea of leveraging other people's sort of attitudes to it sounds like it would appeal to some of the people who struggle with making moves on this sort of thing. Kathleen, is there anything that you would like to jump in on this one? Or if not, we can move to the next question if you like.
Yeah, happy to move on.
Okay. So our next question is there any advice to early career architects and graduates on how to better educate themselves on equity, diversity and inclusion if their workplaces are not advocating for these ideals? And sort of this was something that I wrote down where there are people who think they might be doing it, but you don't feel that they are. Are there ways to maybe help yourself become more educated or educate those other people that sort of might reveal some gaps in their own thinking that maybe you could give us some tips on?
Well, I guess I just mentioned, and Jane's just put up a link to Diversity Council Australia. I do think, I mentioned before, that answering the question, I do think having a few facts at your fingertips. So, I mean, presumably the Institute has some diversity data. I mean, I think knowing a little bit about the sector you're in and where it's at, because often what I've found over many years and heard from other women is there's sort of this reluctance to it. They're sort of like, oh, everything's fine, isn't it? Because it is for people who are in charge often enough. The system's worked for them, right? They often find it very difficult. It's not necessarily that they're evil, but then they don't even recognise that there's an issue because, hey, I did okay. And everyone else who's in charge looks just like me, so we must be the ones. It's kind of it's an interesting sort of closed loop thinking. So you actually, I think, do have to point out, yeah, but there's only this many women in this kind of at this level and so on. So you can't do that all the time because it can be very irritating and it may not have the effect that you want it to have. But I do think there is more and more information available. But I think also, and I love Daniel's point about looking at rival organisations, that can be highly effective. Oh, did you hear so-and-so's put in blah, blah, blah. That can be really interesting. I think also, examining, look at me, white, middle class. I'm always sort of saying, making some room for other people and being conscious of the effect that you're having in the group too is an important one. So, but I think all of that, if you are these days, given what's been happening with Black Lives Matter and a whole lot of other things, if you are looking at cohorts that are, as I said, very homogenous, I mean, they're going to increasingly look out of sync. And that's not going to be the way you will build a sustainable business. I mean, I don't know what the graduate numbers are in architecture and design, but I would be thinking you'd have a lot of women coming out of those courses. There's a mismatch there. This doesn't necessarily change people's minds automatically, but I think having some of that information and using it judiciously can be really helpful.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much, Kathleen. That's fantastic advice. I think that's really great to hear. Daniel, would you like to add anything to that?
I guess I would just say you're doing it now, really. This is it. And it's lifelong, you know, that's something, you know, society is really fucked up, and there is so much disadvantage out there for people that the barriers are so immense, and there's so many, that the work of removing those barriers and creating better accessibility and inclusivity, that is a lifelong thing, and it is a lifelong learning, and it will continue, and the fabric of what that looks like will continue to change. And so often it's like, oh, I don't get it, I don't understand it. Well, it's because it's complicated, and of course, like, you know, it's different every time. So it is just really about chipping away at that, your own prejudices, and as well as your own learning, and building that like a muscle over throughout the rest of your life.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you all. This has been such a fantastic session, and I know I personally have gotten a lot out of it, a lot to take away and think about, and some sort of action items that will be, I think, staying with me for a while. So this has been amazing. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank the Institute, EmAGN, and SONA